now.
All right.
We'll give this
Yeah, no problem.
another minute. And we will get started. Yeah, we're doing a process here because we're a city agency. The mayor has asked that we do contact tracing. So what we do is we offer folks when they come in the building, we take names and keep counts just to make sure our occupancy levels are appropriate. But then we also give folks the option to opt in for the contact tracing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Program. You know, happily, we have not had to use it, as far as I know. No one has asked for information from the health department, so I think so far we've kept the building pretty secure as far as the virus.
We had one. Well, it wasn't really a scare; it was for real. One of my coworkers back in early August contracted COVID, and was a young woman that I worked fairly closely with. And I mean, we have our safety protocols, and so no one else caught it, but. Unfortunately, I mean, obviously long term, some of the effects we don't really know, but at least in the immediate, she had a very mild case of it. So she didn't have to be hospitalized. She was uncomfortable, but not, you know, and she was kind enough to, we knew somebody had, but they wouldn't tell us who just because of, you know, confidentiality.
Yeah, right.
But we have a pretty good working relationships outside of work. So she texted me quick and said, hey, you know, I know we spent like an hour yesterday putting those bags together. So you should know this in case, you know, you want to get tested. Which was funny because the day she texted me, I had woken up maybe an hour before she texted me with a sore throat and been a little like, not really great about this. I just called out and said, let me just be careful. And then I got the text and I'm like, yeah, Dr. Banker, can you get me in for testing today? Because I just want to make sure. It's very mild, but let's be sure.
Yes,
so I went in, and
safe
of course,
than sorry.
That was how I felt about it. So I went in, and by next day they had me negative. They said, nope, you just got really cruddy seasonal allergies. So it stayed with her.
Like Nora O'Donnell says, stay positive and test negative. So.
There you go. Exactly.
And on that note, I think we'll get started.
Super fun.
We have 6 folks joining us right now. I am expecting a few more, but I don't want to keep the folks that are
of course
prompt waiting for too long. So I'll start with our introduction. So good evening. I'm Chris Johnson, the director at the Attleboro Public Library, and thank you for joining us this evening for our program. I'm sure I get the correct name, Hunting the Forest Spirit Mythological Anime. This program this evening is being funded through our NEA Big Read grant, and the NEA Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. This is a copy of our events calendar. If you haven't yet gotten one of these, please do stop by the library or visit the grant website, which is Attleboro's 1abc.org, and you can download a PDF version of the calendar. We have about 25 different programs and book discussions occurring over the 2 months, all based around our featured book this year, which is Circe by Madeline Miller, including a live virtual conversation with the author on October 8th. So thank you to the NEA Big Read for this evening, and thank you to our presenter for joining us for this program. Sarah Hodge Weatherby is a library associate with the Springfield City Library. She had been touring around New England pre-COVID, lecturing on various aspects of pop culture for over 10 years. Now, happily, she's also making these programs available virtually, which is a good thing for us. She's performed for all sorts of venues, from the Norman Rockwell Museum to the Massachusetts Library Association. She loves a good ghost story, thinks Mark Ruffalo is the best Hulk, and prefers a good cup of Earl Grey tea hot, as do I. Although I actually do like it cold, I would say, as well. And we are going to have Sarah back with us again next month. So if you enjoyed this evening's presentation, I hope you'll mark your calendar for October 30th, I believe is the date that we have Mysterious Massachusetts.
I believe so.
Planned. Yes. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the program to Sarah, and I'm actually going to turn off my video so that she can take over our screen.
Thank you so much, Christina. That's a great introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Very honored to be part of your city reads. That's extremely cool. We haven't done that in my city for quite a few years, but it was one of my favorite things to do at the library. And I have to admit, Marguerite, I'm seeing your response here about finishing the book. I have not yet read this. It is on my to-read list, but I definitely would like to read it as soon as possible. So let's get started. I don't know if there's any anime fans in the audience, but if not, hopefully we'll be introducing you to some very interesting anime, and we'll be talking about some mythology at the same time. For the folks in the audience that may not be familiar with anime, anime is a particular type of storytelling, filmmaking, and also used in TV shows and things along that line. It is animation that is created in Japan. And one of the interesting things about Japanese anime is that traditionally they have looked at animation as being a storytelling format for all ages. So you can find anime that is aimed towards children, you can find anime that's aimed towards teens, you can find anime that's aimed towards adults, and you can find anime that's kind of all ages and aimed through all of these groups. America has had some things along this line, obviously some old, I'm a big fan of the old like Looney Tunes, Warner Brothers type things, and those of course are very funny for kids, but also full of jokes for the adults. But we've only sort of recently been catching up with the idea that animation is something that can be used to tell stories of all types. So hopefully you will see some stories here that might be interesting to you. So let me do my screen share and we'll get started. Okay, excellent. And I do not think I can see, let's see. So True Confessions, I can, oh yes I can, hold on, here it is. Just want to bring up the chat room. Actually, I don't know that I can get to the chat room, so I guess I'll go without, and then hopefully Christine will let me know if there's anything that I should be addressing in the actual chat room. So tonight we're going to talk about how anime has incorporated both Japanese mythology and also world mythology in some of its storytelling. And to start off with, one of the things we first have to start talking about is what a myth is in the first place. This is sort of something that's a little more contested, I guess, than you would actually think. But a good way of putting it is that Webster's dictionary says that a myth is usually a traditional story that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. And the interesting thing about this is that, especially in America, we tend to use the word mythology to talk about sacred beliefs that are no longer held by a majority of people. So when we're kids and we're in school, we talk about things like Greek and Roman mythology or Norse mythology. And these are groups of people who are mostly no longer practicing these religions. These are gods and stories that we sort of look at as things of the past, but really mythology can be applied to multiple stories and multiple belief systems all around the world. Christianity is full of mythology. Christian mythos is a thing in itself. Buddhism also full of mythology. Any religious or belief system that has stories is mythology. And this is something that's very important to acknowledge, because when we're talking about these things as being reflected in popular works, it's easy to forget that even the more recent ideas of religion and sacred stories can be reflected as well. I also like to bring it up because in the past, when I've talked about mythology and used some of these examples, I've had people come up to me afterwards and say like, well, I was a little offended because I'm a Buddhist and you called this mythology, or I'm a Christian and you called this mythology. So I like to make sure that we understand that, of course, that's only saying that this is a sacred story to a particular group of people. Now, we're also going to talk a little bit about folk and fairy tales, because while they're not mythology, they do have some similarities to mythology, and they have, you can call them kind of cousins of mythology. So, and again, these are kind of contested definitions, even when you get into people who are professional folklorists or study these sort of things. You get 3 of them in a room and 3 of them won't give you the exact same definition. But I like these particular definitions because I think they kind of round out the ideas. So a fairy tale tends to be a story, often for children, but not always. We sometimes forget that Grimm's fairy tales can be quite grim, in fact. And these usually involve fantastic forces or sort of strange beings as fairies or wizards or trolls and goblins, these sort of things, and usually have some sort of magical or mystical element to them. Folk tales are slightly different in the idea that it's very hard often to trace exactly where folk tales come from. There's no original author. It's simply a folk tale from this particular culture. This usually is a story that was passed around orally and often is a teaching tale or has some sort of point to it that is trying to pass on knowledge to other people. So all of these three are going to come into the conversation that we're having about mythology. So what does all this have to do with anime? Well, it's pretty simple, actually. So any of these stories, mythology, folk tales, fairy tales, they all influence the types of stories that we tell as cultures. So for example, I wanted to point out a particular fairy tale that's very popular in America, very popular in Western culture, and that's the Cinderella story. So we all sort of know a basic version of the Cinderella story. It may be the Grimm's version, a lot of people are familiar with. It may be the French version that came along a little bit later on, but everyone has an idea of what that is going to look like. So we have a young girl whose father or whose parents' figures pass away. There's a step figure, usually a stepmother involved. She's being treated very poorly. There's some kind of an intervention. Usually in the traditional tale, it's magical. It's a fairy godmother or a magical tree that gives her gifts or something along that line. She's allowed to go to the ball. She meets the prince. And by the end of the story, she becomes the victor by marrying the prince and going on to a better life. If you're reading the Grimm's fairy tale version, there's some very grim things in there, especially with the stepsisters trying to get their feet into the shoe, but we'll skip that for now. And of course, as a culture, we have retold this story over and over and over again. The most famous one, of course, for most people is the Disney version. Walt Disney did a wonderful animated version of this back in the 1940s, late 40s, early 50s, I believe. But of course, this also shows up in more contemporary retellings. Pretty in Pink, which was sort of a teen romantic comedy from the 1980s, tells the Cinderella story with a modern twist. There's no magic involved. The young lady who goes to prom to meet her prince is given a dress by her neighbor who makes the dress for her. And there's an even more recent uptelling of this in the late 1990s called She's All That, with the same basic plot line. It actually also has a very similar plot line to My Fair Lady in another way, so it's kind of interesting. But we can see how this fairy tale has become part of the cultural storytelling to the point where it's even influencing some more modern stories as well. And of course, Japanese anime is no exception. Anime takes in its own cultural storytelling and adds it into the storylines that it's telling in animated form. So we're going to talk a little bit about two classifications that show up in mythology. And these are sort of my own classifications, but I think they sort of make sense. The first group we're going to talk about is mythological icons, or things that are based off of a particular story. So those are things that visually show up in anime that are based on something very specific, or an anime that is based off a particular piece of mythology or folklore. The second group is not based off of a particular story, but has themes that are very common in mythos and folklore, and very important to how the story is being told. So we're going to start with an anime that I quite liked from the mid-2000s called Witch Hunter Robin. Now, Witch Hunter Robin is a little gothic. It's a little bit darker. It's for older teens and maybe adults. It tells the story of a group of people in Japan who are a government agency, sort of a shadow agency, and their job is to find people with special powers who have become out of control and neutralize them. They're protecting the public from these unknown people with these powers that are referred to as witches throughout the show. In that sense, it's very similar to things like Fringe and the X-Files and that sort of thing, but with a much more sort of an overtone of an X-Men, or, you know, people very obviously have powers. A couple of people in this group actually have powers of their own. Robin Senna, who was our main character here with the blonde hair, is in fact a power user herself. And the anime talks about a whole host of subjects, talking about things like people with special abilities as a group of prosecuted people, very much in the same way that X-Men does. Ideas of, should we trust our governments, or are our governments doing things that we may not know about, and does that make them trustworthy? But it also comes up with some very interesting mythological connections. The two first ones I want to talk about is the writing systems that you see throughout the anime. You'll often see circles or other inscriptions while they're investigating various cases of people using these powers. And all of these various, oops, it looks like somebody said something in the chat. Let me see if I can bring that up. I apologize if I'm, you know what, I apologize. I cannot see the chat. It seems like it's something that I can't bring up on my screen.
That was me. That
Oh,
was
okay.
me, Sarah. This is Chris. I was just letting
thank you
people
so
know
much,
that I'm
Chris.
going to send out your resource list.
Oh,
so
yes,
if they were
excellent.
taking notes. Yeah.
Sorry, Chris. I'll rely on you from now on with that.
Yes.
I apologize, guys.
Yes, if there's anything there, I'll just unmute and forward.
Excellent. You're wonderful. She is wonderful, isn't she? The writing systems that are used in the show to sort of give it a mystical feel are actual, really writing systems that were used in a couple of different ancient cultures. The one that most people are more familiar with is the Norse Runes. Runes was a writing system that was used in Old Norse culture, both as actual writing system in a day-to-day way, but also as sort of a sacred writing system. It was used in things like divination and in making inscriptions of charms and things like that that they would use in order to communicate with their gods. This comes up in Witch Hunter Robin quite a bit. The writing system that most people aren't as familiar with is referred to as Ogam. And this is a writing system that was used in ancient Celtic cultures, particularly in Scotland and Ireland, but also in France and a few other places. And this is a system of just lines that are sort of either straight up and down, stacked on top of each other, or at a little bit of a diagonal. And again, it was used very similar in the way of Norse runes, in the sense of it could be used to communicate on a day-to-day basis, but it was also used in a religious and ceremonial way. One of the really interesting things that Witch Hunter Robin does that I particularly like about this series is that it also does something really interesting with history. So we have a way of taking history and turning it almost into folklore. If we look at some of the more familiar pieces of storytelling, things like Robin Hood and things like the King Arthur cycles of stories, there's a lot of debate in historical circles about whether these are completely fictional, sort of folklorish works, or if some of these figures are based or loosely based on either actual historical people or more likely groups of historical people. For example, it's thought that King Arthur might be sort of a conglomeration of several different warlords and chieftains that were in the Celtic countries at the time that these stories were first taking shape, and that the idea that Robin Hood himself might in fact be several different historical figures kind of rolled into one. Witch Hunter Robin does a really interesting thing with this, where they take a very well-known piece of Massachusetts history, the Salem witch trials, and rolls it into its narrative, but puts a spin on it that makes it very much in that sort of folkloric retelling. So they add some things to it that obviously didn't really happen at that time period, but they give it very much the feel of these old pieces of folklore. Oops. Fruits Basket is another very popular anime that's come out in the last 20 years. And a large theme of Fruits Basket was actually talking about the Chinese zodiac. All of the characters in the show, save for one, are associated with each of the animals from the Chinese zodiac, including the cat, who doesn't actually appear on the zodiac, but there's a whole series of stories about why the cat is not actually one of the zodiac animals. And that's a very interesting piece of Chinese mythology. It has to do with Buddha and Buddhism, but it's a very heavy theme in Fruits Basket. Princess Mononoke, which is a beautiful film by Miyazaki from Studio Ghibli, has an overarching storyline that delves very deeply into Shintoism, particularly with the idea of spirits in nature, everything including stones and things we would not think of as having its own spirit, having a spirit and sort of dealing with mortals and other people in this film. While it's not an exact match to any particular piece of mythology, it's very heavily influenced by Shintoism. And in that same vein, Mushishi, which is a TV series that deals with a man who walks around, I think it's the Meiji era in Japan, and deals with Shinto spirits that have gotten out of control. He talks to spirits and monsters and gets them to leave people alone or move back into sort of the spirit realm. And again, this is very heavily steeped in Japanese Shinto mythology. Revolutionary Girl Utena is a really interesting piece of this. We're going to see her again very soon. But it's an anime that came out in the mid-1990s that deals with a private school where much more is going on behind the scenes than it seems. It has a lot to do with heroics. It also asks questions about things like gender roles and the idea of women who have decided to step out of the traditional Japanese gender roles and how that affects their world. One of the things that you see throughout the series are these little cutaways in the middle of the story where you'll see these two girls who are in shadow completely. You can see one of them here on the right-hand side of the slide. And the two girls' shadows will talk back and forth about what exactly you've just seen in the episode, making commentary on what's happened so far, and then making commentary on what they think might happen in the second half of the episode. This is extremely close to the idea of the Greek chorus. In a lot of Greek plays, who are very heavily based in their mythology, the idea that there would always be this sort of group of people that were sort of making commentary outside the action, talking about how the gods might react to things, this is absolutely taken from that idea. Journey to the West is a Buddhist story that is very popular in multiple Eastern countries. It's very big in India, China loves it very much, and also Japan has picked it up. And this is an epic Buddhist story about a monk who goes forward into the world to find these particular scrolls of Buddhist wisdom. And he is assigned several mythological figures to go with him to help him on his journey, including a very popular character in Eastern mythology, the Monkey King. This story is actually folded into multiple animes, but two of the biggest ones that you can really see the influence. One is a very popular anime called Dragon Ball Z, which at first doesn't seem to have much to do with it. It's mostly guys fighting each other, to be quite honest. But the more you get into the storyline and the more you start looking at the characters, you're realizing that different characters are most certainly based on characters from Journey to the West. Most particularly that the main character, Goku, is most certainly based off of the Monkey King. And then, of course, a little bit later on in the early 2000s, another anime came out called Sayuki, which is literally a one-to-one translation and one-to-one interpretation of the Journey to the West story, but with science fiction elements along with some of the more mythological ones. And this is actually one of the most popular anime of all time. Sailor Moon hit the United States back in the early 1990s and has stayed strong ever since. And Sailor Moon is very interesting in the fact that all of its characters are named after the various planets, which of course are also named after Greek gods. That could just simply be because it's associated with astrology, and each of the girls in the anime has a power based on their astrological sign. But it's also interesting to see how each of the girls who are associated with each of these god names, as well as the planets, have some of the traits of those gods. For example, Sailor Mars has a sharp temper, she uses fire magic, and she's a warrior at heart, which is very much along the same lines as Ares, who is also known as Mars. And I'm going to go back to Revolutionary Girl Utena here for a moment. Utena also brings up a very popular piece of Japanese folklore, but Japanese mythology, I should say, which is the story of the sun goddess, who was one of their major deities in Shintoism. And there is a very famous and popular story about the sun goddess having her brother come to visit her in her palace. The brother acts in a very terrible way where he destroys part of her house and does all of these things that offends her greatly. And because of the fact that none of the other gods will intervene on her behalf, she decides to basically take revenge by going into a cave, rolling a rock in front of her cave, and being basically like, I'm done, I'm staying in here, we're all finished. And of course, this is a huge problem because she is literally the sun. If the sun suddenly decides to go into a cave and doesn't come out again, most life on Earth is going to be in big trouble. So the crops begin to wither and people begin to sicken and die, and the animal populations begin to go down. And this is a terrible thing for the gods to deal with because, of course, the gods also need worshipers. So they get together and have a conversation about what they're going to do about this. And the goddess of the harvest comes up with this idea and tells them to hang a mirror in front of the cave along with a piece of rope. She gets a tub, a wash tub, turns it upside down and starts to do this extremely funny dance. In fact, in some of the text, it's either a comedic dance or sometimes it's a very seductive dance. Either way, the gods start to cheer her on and whoop and holler and make all of this noise joyfully. The sun goddess is thinking to herself, why are they making all this joyful noise? Everything is dying. They should be miserable. She rolls the rock back from her cave to step out to see what's going on. And the first thing she sees is the mirror that they've hung in front of the cave, where she sees her own beauty. And she's so enthralled by her own beauty that several gods are able to kind of run behind her and loop the rope in front of the cave so that she can't go back in. And this is how they save the world and bring the sun back to us. Revolutionary Girl Utena does a very interesting thing with this, where we find out that the main character's story, when she was a young girl, her parents both passed away. And she's so sad and miserable about this that she crawls underneath the coffin of one of her parents and refuses to come out again. And one of the other main characters, who is a large part of the story, has to come and coax her back out from underneath that coffin in order to become part of life again, which is very much a direct reference right back to this very popular piece of mythology. We're going to talk about general themes in anime from this time on, and some of these themes that come up quite a bit. So this is a theme that I like to call the inhuman human, but if you're looking at sort of scholarly works on folklore, they call this the Animal Bridegroom. The most popular story of the Animal Bridegroom comes to us in the form of Beauty and the Beast. Most people in the West know this story. It is a story of a prince who is turned into a monster. It is the story of a girl that has to learn to see past his monstrous appearance and fall in love with him and see him as a human being. And only by doing that is she able to save him at the end of the story. Anime deals with some of these ideas all across the spectrum. Obviously, in a lot of fantasy anime, we have characters who are literally transformed into monsters. On the far left, this blue-skinned, very pouty-looking fellow is Zelgadis from the 1990s anime Slayers, who is betrayed by an uncle of his own and turned into sort of a demonic, half-human, half-rock monster, half-demon. I guess that's more than one hat, a couple of halves, isn't it? But this sort of mix of magical creatures, and he's trying to find a way to change himself back and regain his humanity. While in the actual course of the anime, he never physically becomes a human being again. By finding a group of people who accept him for who he is and become his friend and companions, his humanity starts to reassert itself as being part of that team. But one of the themes I find really interesting about this is that it's not just to fantasy anime, but can also show up in other genres. One of the places you see this come up a lot is science fiction anime. And a lot of science fiction anime will talk about some of the same ideas that our own science fiction talks about. What makes you human? How do you know if you're human if technology starts to become such a part of your life that it might even overtake your humanity? A perfect example of this is our couple right here on the side. The young blonde woman is Dunan Newt, and the strange cyborg companion she has that looks a little bit like a cyborg bunny, that is Briorius. And this couple is part of a science fiction anime and manga, which is the comic version, called Appleseed. And Briorius is actually a human being who at one point was completely human, and during a sort of a global war ends up having his body mostly destroyed, but his life is saved because his brain and some of his internal organs are transferred into this giant hulking cyborg body. So he's able to continue living, but part of what Appleseed talks about is his feeling of isolation from other people, because now he appears to be this big, scary sort of monstrous cyborg, when really he's a very awesome guy that just wants to be friends. And of course, Dunan is his love interest, and she does not give up on him, which is very lovely. But that is a direct comparison to this theme in science fiction. The magical meeting is a really wonderful theme that I'm quite a big fan of. And this comes up in a lot of folklore and mythology. One of the more popular ones from the West talks about the idea of usually a prince or a young nobleman who rides out with his entourage on a hunting trip. And during that hunting trip, they come across some kind of an animal that is something really special. It's usually a white doe, but sometimes it can be a very beautiful rabbit or a different type of animal, depending on what part of the world the story is being told in. The young prince will ride after the doe, trying to hunt it, and one by one, all of his companions fall behind. Their horses are too exhausted, the dogs are too exhausted. This white deer just keeps outrunning everyone until only the prince is left in pursuit. And when he alone is with it, the deer will come into a clearing, turn around, and then stand up and drop its doe skin, and it becomes the queen of the fairies. It turns out that this is another form that she takes. And she says to him, I've lured you here because I've chosen you as my champion. You've proven yourself a fine hunter and a strong man by being able to keep up with me, and I've chosen you for this mission, or sometimes it's to be my consort. It kind of depends on the story. But so he has this meeting of two different people from completely different worlds that meet in the center. Anime does this all over the place, in some ways very beautifully, in some ways very savage. I like to use these two examples because they very much sort of bookend that whole idea. So Miyazaki from Studio Ghibli is the director of both of these films. So the picture that you see here of the young girl who's falling from the sky surrounded by light is one of the opening sequences from a story called Castle in the Sky. And in this film, the young boy who's kind of watching her come down is going through his town to bring lunch to some of the other miners that he works with. And he notices this beautiful, what appears to be a star kind of slowly coming through the atmosphere. And he realizes there's something strange about this, follows it to the center of town until he's almost on top of a pit that leads down to the mines, and realizes that it's not a star at all, but this young girl who's surrounded by light and slowly drifting down like a feather. He watches this in wonder, and as she comes closer to him, he opens up his arms, and as she comes into his arms, all of a sudden the light disappears and she becomes heavy, and he has to kind of take her over to the side. And that unearthliness goes away from her, and she simply becomes a girl again. And there's a whole reason for this, but in case you want to see the film, I won't tell you what it is. But it's very much this example of two worlds meeting, this very normal, everyday boy seeing what appears to be almost an angel falling from the sky. Miyazaki does this again in the film Princess Mononoke, who we see over on the far right hand with the giant wolf behind her. During the course of this film, it is involved with a young prince whose name is Ashitaka. He is on a journey, and while he's on his journey, he oversees a giant wolf. It's referred to as one of the wolf gods of the forest, who has been shot in a battle. And when he finds the wolf, he discovers that there's a young woman with it, who is trying to remove the bullet literally by sucking the wound, spitting out blood, and trying to suck the bullet out from what we later learn is her mother. This is her adopted mother. He accidentally makes a small sound. The young woman turns around and faces him with this extremely hostile and fierce expression on her face. And as you can see, blood smeared all over her face from what she was trying to accomplish. And it's a very different magical meeting. There's this wild creature that is human but barely seems human from a world that he can't understand, facing off with him in a way that you're not sure if they're going to just go or if she's literally going to jump across the river and try to kill him. But it's very much in the same idea, simply with a different sort of feeling laid over it. In some of the same idea, the idea of crossing worlds or having someone from our world end up in something different is a very popular theme in Japanese anime and also in Western culture. Most of us read things like The Chronicles of Narnia when we were kids, and kids going through a magic wardrobe into another world, or Alice in Wonderland, where she possibly has a dream or possibly simply falls into an underworld. And of course, this comes into mythology all the time. When we talked earlier about the stories of the young prince who finds the fairy queen, often that leads into a story where he crosses over into fairy in order to go on his quest. There's also a very popular version of this in Japanese mythology, in Shinto mythology, that talks about a young fisherman who finds a turtle who is injured, takes care of it, untangles it from the fishing nets it's tangled in, and re-releases it into the ocean. And several nights later, the turtle comes back and says, the king of the sea dragon, wants to reward you. If you'll come with me, the emperor of the ocean will reward you. And he rides the turtle under the ocean and meets with the emperor of the ocean, and the turtle transforms into the emperor's beautiful young daughter. And he says, you've saved my daughter in her alternative form, and I will reward you. Here are riches, here's a place in my palace. The fisherman and the daughter fall in love, and they get married, and he has this wonderfully happy life. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end very happily, because he also misses his family and asks permission to return to visit them. And the sea emperor says, you can go back, but you're going to take this box with you, and you cannot open the box while you're on the shore. The box will help protect you, but as soon as you open it, I can't help you any longer. and they return him to the shore. And as he's walking around, he realizes that he doesn't recognize anything. And soon it becomes very apparent that where he, in his experience, only a year has passed on the shore, it's actually been 500 years and everyone that he knows is gone. And in despair, he opens the box to see if there's maybe something in there that will help him. And the box actually contains his age. So it comes over him, and all at once he becomes 500 years old and crumbles into dust. It's kind of a sad ending. But of course, this is, you know, crossing worlds and having these magical experiences in worlds, whether for good or for ill. Anime does this all the time. There's a group of artists that were referred to as Clamp that were very popular in the 1990s and early 2000s that did a heroic anime about a group of girls who are transported into another world and given the titles of knights and given a quest to save that world. It was called Magic Knights Rayearth. Miyazaki also has done multiple films that deal with this. He did a very charming retelling of a version of The Little Mermaid, Ponyo by the Sea, or Ponyo as it was called here, where the Little Mermaid's actually a very little girl who sometimes looks like a goldfish. And she comes to live on land for a while with her friend and has these sort of magical adventures, and they sort of save the town. It was really charming. So this idea that both we sometimes cross over into other worlds, but also sometimes other things or creatures from other worlds will cross into our own. And then, of course, anyone that studies mythology and folklore knows a little bit about the journey of the hero, the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell, who was a very famous writer on these things, talked a lot about this in his books. And this is sort of a basis of storytelling altogether. You don't have much of a story unless some sort of a journey or some kind of a heroic thing is happening. Traditionally, it's thought of as being something that tends to be more along the violent side. So we have things like, I'm going to go into the maze and find the Minotaur and kill him, or I'm going to ride out into the hills and rescue the damsel and kill the dragon. But sometimes it can be a much more personal story. One of my personal favorite hero's journeys is actually referred to as the Seven Swans, or sometimes the Three Ravens. And this is a story of a young princess whose brothers are transformed into birds by an evil stepmother. And she has to go on a journey to find out how to change them back into men, and goes through a multi-year journey of various accomplishments and some suffering in order to do this deed. So her journey is very much the hero's journey as well. Anime is full of this, of course. We want to watch these heroes go through their journeys. Inuyasha, which also could qualify as a world crossing because the main character, Kagome, is a modern Japanese girl who was brought into a magical world in the past, and there is a quest that they go on to find various magical jewels, and that's part of their journey of the hero. Samurai 7 is actually one of my very favorites because, again, it mixes some traditional Japanese ideas with science fiction. If anyone's seen the Kurosawa movie, The Seven Samurai, this anime is loosely based on that film, but put into a science fiction setting. And the seven samurai who are hired to defend this village go through their own hero's journey. Some come out the other end heroes, others don't make it out the other end. But it's a very interesting take on that idea of heroes banding together. And then there's the shaman's journey, which is similar to the hero's journey, but rather than being about sort of an accomplishment, what it more is about is bringing back some type of wisdom or some kind of knowledge that your people need. This tends to come up a lot in mythology. For example, Odin in Norse mythology hanging upside down on the world tree in order to gain the knowledge of the runes would fit the shaman's journey. Often this also deals with going into the afterlife for something. While he is going into it in order to gain something for himself, the journey of Orpheus in Greek mythology, when he goes into the underworld and charms Hades and Persephone in order to get his wife back, would also be considered a shaman's journey because it is talking about going into an area that human beings are usually not allowed to be in. Of course, that one also ends a little sad as well. This comes up in multiple ways in anime, but three of my favorite examples are actually all pretty obscure anime. Most people haven't seen them. For those of you that might like a little more action-packed, there is Shamanic Princess, which is a shaman's journey, but does have a little more of the hero's journey component to it as well. They sort of fight demons and do some more sort of action-oriented things. There's also Wandering Continent, which is very interesting, where three adventurers in a very sort of post-apocalyptic world go into what's referred to as the City of the Dead on a quest and have to find their way back out again in a very Orpheus type setting. The most pure, I think, though, is a 1986 film that's based on a very popular Japanese book called Night of the Galactic Railroad. And this involves two boys who in this particular anime are portrayed as anthropomorphic cats, go on a very strange journey one night on a train that takes them throughout the cosmos. And at the end of this journey, they find out that it's been more than just a magical train. They're actually dealing with themes of life and death and the afterlife and questions of spirituality and things along this line. So it seems like a very cutesy little anime, but it's actually extremely deep. And if you can find it, I highly recommend that one. It is a little slow though, so if you're looking for a lot of action, it's probably not for you. Then I'd really love to talk about this particular Miyazaki film. This is The Hero from Spirited Away. And that's because I think Chihiro really kind of blends these two ideas together. She has a classic hero's journey in this film where there's a lot of tasks that she has to do and a journey that she has to go on, but she also has elements to her that are very shamanistic. So for example, she has an instinctual understanding with the character of No Face, who's kind of that weird, scary guy with the white face, that when he's a character that offers gifts to people, and if you show your greed, he consumes you. And she has an instinctual understanding that she doesn't need to accept his gifts, she simply offers him friendship. And that defeats him, but also saves him, makes him from a monster into a very positive character. She also understands that various characters throughout this story are either other characters that she's met in a different form, as her friend that you can see there where she's helping as a dragon, or sometimes characters that have multiple personalities or multiple forms, as in Yubaba, who is the sort of villain of the piece, but then she understands that she has a twin sister that is never presented as anything other than twin sister, but I think it's kind of obvious in the course of the anime that they're actually supposed to be two sides of the same person. And of course, the idea at the very end of the anime where we understand on her journey as she goes into this other world of spirits that her parents accidentally were sucked in and transformed into pigs. And in order to get out of this other spirit world along with her parents, she's given a riddle to solve, and she solves it simply by sort of using the instinctual knowledge she's gained after going throughout this entire journey. And this comes up multiple other places in the film as well. So I find it really interesting that she seems to blend both of these ideas together. Facing the father figure is one of my personal favorites. We, of course, have this in Western culture, not just through mythology and folklore, but also in our own pop culture. Darth Vader coming out that it's Luke Skywalker's father is such a dramatic moment in the Star Wars series. And of course, this happens in Greek mythology all over the place. For one thing, in the story of Kronos eating all of his children, the child Zeus is raised to understand that his job is to overthrow his father and free his siblings from the prison of the grandfather's stomach, basically. There's also stories about Apollo, for example, where Apollo's half-mortal son appears to him and presents himself as his son, and he's so overjoyed to see him that he grants him anything that he wants, and all the son wants to do is to drive his chariot. And Apollo is forced to allow him to do this, which is quite disastrous. But there's a wonderful moment in that story where son and father have to face each other and own up to who they are and what's happened to them in the past. This happens in anime all the time, but two of my favorite examples is The Last Exile, which is from the mid-2000s, which does it in a very interesting way. Rather than being a literal facing of the father, what it is in the very beginning of the anime, we find out that the two main characters' fathers have perished before the story even starts, trying to accomplish something that no one else has ever accomplished. And by the end of the anime, their two children accomplish that deed. So while they don't literally face their fathers, they face the memory of their fathers, and by doing the thing that their fathers couldn't do, surpass them and move on from them. There's also Vision of Escaflowne from the early 2000s, where our main character has to face his brother, who is the dark-winged guy behind him. And while, again, he's not biologically the main character's father, he is a father figure in his life. For quite a long time, they were very close. And then before the anime starts, there's a split. So he has to face up to him before he can triumph. And of course, breaking the taboo is a huge part of mythology. It's all over the place. Greek mythology loves it, and so do fairy tales. So we have things like Pandora's box. Pandora is told by everyone, don't open, all you have to do is have this pretty box on your mantle, but don't open it. And of course she does, and releases all of these terrible things into the world. And of course, the most famous of all Western stories, the Garden of Eden, the whole idea of Adam and Eve being told, you do not eat the fruit from this tree, but falling to temptation, breaking the taboo, and that begins this entire journey, everything past the early Garden of Eden in the Old Testament. And of course, there's sort of minor versions of this as well. The story of Cupid and Psyche, where Psyche is told, you have this wonderful husband and he takes good care of you and everything's wonderful, but you can never look at him. You'll never know what he looks like. And her fear of him being a monster makes her light the candle and have a look at him. And of course, that sets off the entire journey of her having to prove her love and amend for the mistake that she's made here. Anime has this throughout its entire basis, as many of these themes are, but there's a few things that I particularly love. One is Full Metal Alchemist, which is there's actually several different versions of the series, but the original series aired in the very early 2000s, and there's been a few other remakes of it since. And the idea of Full Metal Alchemist is that it's a world where alchemy is very real, the old medieval practice of alchemy. And part of the idea of alchemy is that in order to get something, you have to give something. So anytime you kind of put elements together and make something new, there is going to be a cost. And one of the things that is very common, is very well known among alchemists, is the one thing you do is you do not try to bring the dead back to life. It will not end well for you. And of course, the two young brothers who are the main characters, they lose their mother early in the series and they break that taboo and try to bring her back to life. And it causes nothing but pain and terribleness for them. And the entire rest of the anime is about them trying to make amends for what they've done. In Princess Mononoke, we've discussed earlier the Miyazaki film, a large portion of the action for the second half of the film happens when they're talking about the forest spirit, who is a god, a very mysterious god of life and death, who moves throughout the forest. And throughout the entire series, people have talked about hunting the forest spirit. And any character who's connected on the spiritual realm has said, do not do this. Do not mess with this. This is a thing of life and death beyond us. You should not play with this. And Lady Eboshi, who's sort of the main antagonist, decides that she will hunt the forest spirit. And when she does, when she kills him, she doesn't really kill him, she transforms him through that action into something destructive with no life to it, with something that it is endless death. And our two protagonists have to find a way to fix this and stop what's happening. So it's a really wonderful example of this. And Seeking the Mythic Lands comes up a bit. And anyone that's done any research into things like the story of Atlantis. Atlantis has captured our imagination for thousands of years as this mythical land that maybe we can find somewhere. This also comes up in Arthurian legend, the idea of King Arthur, after he's been mortally wounded, being sent away to the Isle of Avalon, or the Isle of Apples, as it's referred to sometimes, and the idea that this mystical island exists somewhere and we could go off and find it. There's something really interesting with Japanese anime where they really seem to love Atlantis. They always have these stories that end up having something to do with Atlantis. So Vision of Escaflowne that I referred to earlier has a main theme where the two protagonists, or the protagonist and the antagonist, the brothers that have to face each other, are actually descendants of the original people from Atlantis. There's also several other anime that come up that talk about trying to find Atlantis, and it just seems to be a very, very popular idea. Also, interestingly enough, in the late 2000s, there was a very strange but wonderful anime called Wolf's Rain, that again is not quite as well known as a lot of others, but I enjoyed it very much. That not only had some Hindu ideas of the birth-death cycle idea, and the idea of reincarnation and rebirth, but also deals with a literal pack of wolves who are looking for a mythical land they've been promised. If they can get to this mythical land, they will be able to live free and not be afraid of humans anymore. And that's a huge, huge part of the motivation of that particular anime. And related as well, the end of the world tends to be something that comes up again. Wolf's Rain, as we were just talking about, has a huge theme of the world winding down. It takes place in a post-apocalyptic world where it's very obvious that things are stopping. And that the world itself may in fact be ending. Clamp had a big series called 1999, X 1999, that was also all about the end of the world and a group of people trying to stop it, with an appearance of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, used in a very sort of Japanese way, but definitely based on the Western idea of what those characters would look like. And Revolutionary Girl Utena, as we've talked in several other places, also has a sort of underlying theme of the idea of not just the world ending, but the world ending and then being rebuilt in a new way that might be better than, in fact, the old world that has just ended. Now, interestingly enough, when we start talking about death and death themes in anime, the idea of death, obviously death has existed forever. It wasn't a strange thing in Japanese culture, but Japanese culture didn't really have this idea of a death god or of a death figure in the way that we tend to think of, say, the Grim Reaper. Death was sort of more an overlaying idea throughout Japanese mythology, but there usually wasn't just one figure that sort of encompassed this. This seems to be a much later development that happened somewhere, depending on who you're talking to, somewhere between the late 1600s and maybe the very early 1800s. Although from some of what I've been reading, it seems I would go with more like the 1600s end of things. And there's some speculation that this might have to do with some early contact by Western missionaries and with some of these ideas coming through. Wherever exactly it came from, there's multiple anime that became very popular that have to do with death gods or death spirits or people that deal with the afterlife as sort of these guardian spirits. Both Bleach and the anime Soul Eater deal with people whose literal jobs are to act as Grim Reapers. They're there to help people get into the afterlife and to deal with spirits and ghosts that maybe got trapped here and then became corrupted and dangerous, not because they themselves were evil, but because they're stuck and they don't know what to do, and that sort of transforms them into something else. So in that period, those groups of people kind of become part of those anime. Death Note was a different anime that had a very interesting set of questions to it, that involved a young man who finds a blank diary that literally will kill anyone, sort of mystically kill anyone whose name that he writes in the diary in different ways. And one of the main characters that deals with him is a literal death god, one of many, who we find out later has left this journal for this young man to find because he's bored and he sort of wants to see what humans are going to do with it. So it's kind of an interesting, it's not a light anime, it's definitely not one for the kids, but it is a really, really interesting thing. Oh, I'm sorry, I realized somebody asked a question and I missed it. Oh, Pompoko, I almost forgot about that. That's a great question, Heather. So the question that was asked is, can you tell us what some of the myths are that are referenced by the spirit parade in the end of Pompoko? So it's been a little while since I've seen Pompoko, to be honest with you. But funny enough, I know it a little bit because of a different presentation I do. So I can answer that. I know for a fact that they use, and I'm going to forget the name of it, but there's a mythological, or it's more like folklore, but a folkloric Japanese monster that comes out of the ground. It's a giant skeleton. It's very frightening. And the idea of that particular creature is that it is the kind of bones of people who have died violently, usually on battlefields and things like that, that can't rest properly. So their bones at night sort of arrange themselves into these giant skeletons that eat people. So you see one of those in Pompoko's parade at the end. I don't recall if these guys are in the parade, but there's a big sequence with them in Pompoko where it's the ghosts that have no face. They're literally, they look like regular human beings, but they have no face. And there's a reference to a very popular sort of Japanese ghost story in that, where in Pompoko, there's a guy on a bicycle that sees them, and he sees this person that has no face, and he freaks out and he runs somewhere else, and he sees another person with no face, and he runs into a convenience store and he's like, there's these people and they have no face, and all the people turn and they all have no face, and he's absolutely freaking out. It turns out they're all the tanuki, who are sort of spiritually powered animals. Tanuki are actual animals from Japan, but they have a sort of a association with tricksters and spiritual animals in the same way that foxes do. And that's a direct reference to a very popular ghost story about a man who, coming back as a woodcutter to his sort of medieval time period village, finds a young woman at the side of the road who's crying and tries to comfort her. And then when she turns, she has no face, and he freaks out and runs into town. And each group of people he runs into has no face, all the way up to the very end where he goes to his own home and he thinks he's safe, and his wife turns around and she has no face. And then he wakes up at the side of the road where he started and is able to go home. But the implication is that these kind of trickster ghosts had given him this dream. Those particular ghosts are not malevolent, but they like to play tricks on people. So I know they're in Pompoko as well, but it's been a really long time since I've seen the Spirit Parade, so I don't remember any of the others. But I can look into that for you, Heather, if you, once I can access the actual chat room again, I will give you my email address, and feel free to email me and I can look at that sequence again and maybe give you some more information. Oh, the woman with the 3 heads, I do remember her. Oh, you know what? I don't remember what she's actually a reference to though. She might be one of the snake women with the long necks, because sometimes they can have more than 1 head, but I'm not 100% sure. I can look into that for you, Heather, though. I'd be more than happy to do that. Okay, so I just, I want to kind of head up the end of this, and then we can get to some questions. So a lot of this, and he's not the only scholar on this, there's a lot of actually really excellent mythology scholars out there, but I rather like Joseph Campbell. Now, a lot of what he wrote, he died in the late 80s or early 90s. A lot of what he wrote is from the 70s and 80s. So some of it I think is a little outdated. There's some ideas that he has that I don't think translate completely anymore. There's been other evidence that's come forward that I think some of his theories don't hold up. But he did have some really interesting ideas about world mythology altogether. And this kind of rounds up why I think the idea of talking about things like mythology and folklore and popular culture is so important. And these 2 quotes that sort of sum this up are, myths are public dreams and dreams are private myths. He also said, one way or another, we all have to find what best fosters the flowering of our humanity in this contemporary life and dedicate ourselves to that. And both of these things, one of the things that I think about is that the idea that you're never going to know everything about a people through their mythology, and you're never going to know everything about a people through their pop culture. It would be silly to think that you can tell everything about America by watching Marvel superhero films, for example, or that you'll know everything about Western culture by reading Grimm's fairy tales. But you will get an idea of some of the things that that particular culture values, and some of how those values have evolved throughout time, and why certain stories that have been told for hundreds or even thousands of years continue to stay in that particular culture and influence later works. And part of understanding not just ourselves, but other people and other cultures is understanding where some of these bases come from. It's one of the reasons that I personally find both folklore and mythology and also pop culture so fascinating. So I really love to kind of promote the idea of get curious and look into some of these things, because it will get you on the path at least to start to understand some cultures that you might have curiosity about or wanted to learn about in a way that's actually a lot of fun. It gives you a nice kind of a basis that from there you can get into things like history or other cultural pieces, and it all sort of becomes a tapestry altogether to help explain why things are the way they are in certain cultures, and also sometimes why cultures are starting to blend. We see, as we've seen through this whole presentation, anime is heavily influenced by Japanese mythology and folk stories, but it's also really heavily influenced by Western culture and other Eastern cultures as well. And you can see the same thing in America. We now have popular culture where in America we are using Japanese ideas and Japanese ghosts and monsters and things in our own actual filmmaking. The Grudge, for example, The Ring, now those are remakes of Japanese films, but they still use very Japanese ideas about ghosts and sort of terror. And I've really enjoyed seeing how we can interpret that sort of thing. Okay, hold on a second. Okay, I missed the first 20 minutes, but was wondering how you got into Japanese anime. Okay, and what mythology books from Japan you'd recommend to start exploring? Oh, excellent. Chihiro, I love your name, by the way. We did talk a bit about Chihiro. So I have a, Christine is gonna make sure you guys get this. I have a reading and viewing list that goes along with this that I gave to her. And again, Chihiro, when I get back into a screen where I can get to the actual chat room, I'll be happy to drop my email in there as well. And there's other stuff I can recommend. Personally, I got into Japanese anime in kind of an interesting way. So I've always been fascinated by animation. And when I was in college, and I'm going to give away my age here a little bit, I was in college in the mid-90s, so I'm a little bit of an old lady. But early in my sort of college and even late high school, I really started getting interested in animation as a storytelling format. Particularly because I really love a lot of the old like Looney Tunes and some of the old cartoon from the 40s and 50s and even some of the early 60s. And I found it fascinating how a lot of that animation was never considered a kid's thing. It was considered something that everybody could watch. So if you watch old Bugs Bunny cartoons, for example, you're gonna find a lot of stuff that kids will laugh and think that's great, but there's also jokes and things in there that were obviously put in there for adults. So I've always loved the idea of animation as a multi-generational storytelling device. And in the early 90s, when I was in high school and just starting college, there was some American stuff that was coming out that I was really impressed with how well they were doing at being kind of aimed for kids, but really multi-generational storytelling. So things like Batman the Animated Series and a 1990s Disney cartoon called Gargoyles. If anyone has Disney Plus, you can find that. It's an excellent series. So when I was in a college class on filmmaking, I was talking in class about loving animation and loving some of these series. And a wonderful friend of mine pulled me aside afterwards and said, well, you must love anime. And I said, I have no idea what that is. And of course, I did know what it was. I just didn't know what it was. So I grew up with Speed Racer and Voltron and Robotech and all of these series that were really big in the 80s and reruns of stuff that was from the 60s and 70s. But to us, it was just cartoons. It was just the same as, you know, He-Man or Thundercats or any of that kind of stuff. And they were like, oh no, anime, like you really need to see this. So basically she invited me up to her dorm and pulled out a VHS, this is how old I am, VHS tape of Ghost in the Shell, the original 1990, I think it's 1994 Ghost in the Shell film. And we watched it and my mind was just blown. I'd never seen anything like that before and I absolutely fell in love. So I started scooping up anything and everything I could get that was anime, which was a really interesting time to be into anime because, you know, we didn't have streaming services. We didn't even have like big releases of like DVD sets and things like that. Like you literally just kind of had to get whatever VHSs you could get your hands on. And of course, at that time, it was also the beginning of the Sailor Moon craze. It had just started to have some anime really catch on. And later in the 90s, it was Pokemon. That was also the beginning of the Pokemon craze. But I just got fascinated by it as a storytelling unit and got everything I could. A lot of wonderful things, a lot of things that I will never watch again. That's kind of like, you laugh and kind of go, oh my God, I saw this. Do you ever see this? It's pretty wild. But it was fascinating and it really got me to delve deeper into some of what was behind those stories. And I've always been fascinated with mythology and folklore and fairy tales. I was the weird kid that used to come in the library at like 9 years old and tell my librarian, like, do you have the story about Cinderella? But I don't want the Cinderella where like the Walt Disney one. I want the one where the stepsisters cut pieces of their feet off to get into the shoe. You know, so I liked all that like really weird stuff. Oh, Akira is fantastic. I still watch that occasionally because I love it, but I don't know that I've completely, I get about 90% of it, but after all these years, but I think I'm still trying to figure out parts of it. So maybe we should have a Akira viewing party. Maybe we can figure it out together. But yeah, it just kind of, it was the perfect storm of all these different kinds of storytelling that I really loved. And I've loved anime ever since, to the point of obviously loving to do lectures about it, but also I still watch quite a bit of it. And I've worked for multiple conventions over the year. I'm kind of retired at this point. But I used to work for Anime Boston. I did a 10-year stint on the guest relations staff of Anime Boston, and I worked for Kineticon and a few other cons. So I love the storytelling format, and I've really loved getting to be part of the culture as well. Anime fans, well, geek culture fans are some of my favorite people. And I might cosplay occasionally, so. But yeah, but Akira is a good one too. Oh, Robotech is fantastic. It's also one of my very first and my very favorites. In fact, it's not what I met my husband over, but my husband, after we got to be friends and then started dating, I found out that he was really into Robotech too. So that was a lovely point that we could kind of connect with each other and talk about our favorite old episodes. And then, of course, in the time period we started dating in the late 90s, we used to do the thing where you went to Blockbuster Video and you went to the back of Blockbuster and there'd be like, you know, 2 Miyazaki films, you know, something that was like from the adult entertainment only section, and then a couple of things in the middle that were like, we have no idea what they are, and we take whatever was in the middle and watch it and see what it was. And some of it was fantastic and some of it was like, well, that was a thing, but it was fun. But yeah, anime's been a part of my life for pretty much most of my adult life at this point. So that's how I got into it. Yay. Any other questions? Comments? Anything like that?
This is Chris. That was awesome. I mean, did you just do that off the top of your head, or did you actually have notes? It looked like you just were.
No, that particular one. So to be fair, there are some that I present that I have notes, but that one is one of the first ones I created. Oh. So that's one of the presentations I've been doing for, at this point, it's actually probably closer to 15 years, but I've been doing that one for quite a long time. So I can kind of just off the top of my head with a lot of it. But yeah, I've been doing this for a long time.
That was wonderful. You had mentioned about sharing your email address in the
oh yes, in fact, let me do that right now. Absolutely, feel free, anybody. I love to chat with folks about all of this stuff. I will only say that. Oh yes, okay. It was amazing. I think I found a new genre. Yes. I've never seen any anime. Do you have a suggestion for one to watch? That's a great question. And the answer to that is it really depends on the person. So it's a little hard, only because anime, you know, anime is like saying I like American cinema. It's a huge group of things, you know. But I would say if you like some fantasy, but you also like sort of heartwarming stories and you want to just kind of feel really good for a night, pretty much anything by Miyazaki, any of Miyazaki's films. There's some, yes. Oh, okay, Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. Oh, great. All right, so there's lots of good stuff for you out there. Let me think. Yeah, there's so much. So as a Star Wars fan and a Lord of the Rings fan, again, going to Miyazaki, I would say try Spirited Away. Definitely try Princess Mononoke. Princess Mononoke is a little on the older end. They usually do sort of G to PG films. Princess Mononoke is a PG-13. So it's a little more on the sort of older adult end, but not so much that you couldn't share it with your family or have anyone you want over to watch it with you. So that's really wonderful. I like a lot of the space opera type stuff is really fun. So there's Cowboy Bebop, which is a little older. That's from the late 90s. But that has a really nice sort of combination of Star Wars-ish kind of sci-fi along with film noir, which is a really weird combination. Now, just in case you have youngins in the house, Cowboy Bebop is definitely not for children. It's definitely an adult anime. There's some drug use and smoking and people get shot and things like that. It's not super violent or over the top, but just keep in mind it's sort of, you know, on that level. Try to think of something that'd be really close to Lord of the Rings, and there's just so much interesting stuff, but a lot of it's kind of on the older side. Record of Lodoss War might do it for you with the Lord of the Rings kind of stuff. And if you like your fantasy with comedy, it is a little dated, but I still really like it. So I'm a D&D player on top of a lot of other things. And there's an anime from the 90s called Slayers that I talked about briefly in the presentation that is sort of what would happen if you were doing a D&D game and then made an anime based on your adventure. It's very funny and very over the top and very silly. If you like your fantasy more serious, it's probably not going to be for you, but I really like that one. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, that's a good question. So True Confessions is I've only seen a little of it. A friend of mine is super into it and suggested it to me recently, but I'm also literally my third semester in library grad school. So it's been hard for me to keep up with stuff. Oh, of course, My Hero Academia. I completely forgot about that one. My Hero Academia is lovely, and I love it because it's really interesting in the sense that it's a superhero anime. So it takes a lot of the tropes and things that we're used to in Western superhero and kind of puts it through a Japanese lens, which I find really interesting. So there's some things in it that will feel familiar, but there's also a lot of things in it that will be a very different sort of spin on things we're used to when we go see, you know, a big superhero blockbuster. But yeah, My Hero Academia, I'm not as far into it as a lot of other people. I started it fairly late in the game, but it's an excellent anime, especially if you like superhero stuff. I'd highly recommend it. Yeah, it's a really good suggestion. I'm so happy to see so many anime fans in the area, or I wasn't sure how many folks tonight would be into it. But yeah, it's one of my favorite. I like a lot of the kind of weird ones too. Like I was a huge fan of Mushishi. I liked, oh wow, there's one that's, it's also, God, it seems like all my favorites are really old. But there's one from the late 90s that is very weird and very stylized called Serial Experiments Lane that I really like, that actually kind of has a little bit of a hero's journey feel to it and a little bit of a shaman's journey feel to it. And while it's dated in the fact that it's a lot about how technology affects us and how letting technology into our lives can change them both for the better and for the worse. So some of the technology that they show, because it's supposed to take place in the very close future, but it came out in like the late 90s. So some of the tech that you're seeing on screen is outdated, but a lot of the themes are absolutely spot on to things that we're talking about now with things like social media and how does that affect people and, you know, news over media and, you know, fake news or not fake news and what's the difference and how do you tell? A lot of that is in Serial Experiments Lane. So I really like that one. It's very odd and kind of cool. It has an excellent theme song, which is also important. So, yeah. And I'd like to hugely encourage anyone who would like to email me, please do. I'm always happy to make recommendations and I'm happy to take recommendations. One of the ways I love doing these workshops is people always suggest things that I'm like, I don't know about that one, or I only just heard about that one. And that expands my viewing list as well, so yay.
Well, that was wonderful.
Thank you, Christine.
I'm starting my video or not, but there we are.
Thanks a lot,
Give
Chris.
one more plug to the
really
National
fun.
Endowment for the Arts. So I do appreciate everybody who was able to join us this evening. We have recorded it, so it will be up on our Big Read website shortly. If you have friends that couldn't join us and would like to watch the video. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to have Sarah back again in October. I'm pretty certain it's October 30th, but if you go to the Attleboro Library website, you'll see a listing for Mysterious Massachusetts, a different type of theme,
yes.
but Halloween based, as you can guess.
Yes, if you like strange, spooky stories from all over the state, that'll be the one for you.
Yes. So thank you again, Sarah. Really appreciate you doing this for us, and we look forward to seeing you again in just about a month from now. And thanks to all of our attendees. Be well.
Thanks, guys. Can't wait to talk to you. Have a good one.